What did Nintendo Power say? Well, frankly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Welcome to a very special episode of NES Works.
No, it won't. You're suspended.
When I said, who cares, to the question of what did Nintendo Power say in the Hollywood Squares and Three Stooges episode, I wasn't just being glib. I mean, I was being glib, but there was also a deeper meaning there. Back when I hit October 1988 in the NES Works series, I kicked off a featurette called What Did Nintendo Power Say? It's not that Nintendo Power had much of actual value to say from a critical perspective, but as the sole full-scale games-focused print magazine available in the US at that time, that first-party promotional vehicle nevertheless provides a valuable time capsule of console gaming history. But now that we're in the back half of 1989, we don't need to rely on Nintendo's marketing team to tell us what was up. As the American console market grew in size and value, quite a few publishers woke up and realized there was good money to be made by producing games magazines. After the Atari crash, American games media went away. Publications like Atari Age just couldn't hang on. Heck, most computer magazines, even the ones without a specific focus on games, died off. The one exception was this episode's feature publication, Computer Entertainer, which included a section called Video Game Update. Established during the Atari era, my understanding from speaking to Frank Cifaldi of the Video Game History Foundation is that the magazine was launched by a pair of sisters based in Van Nuys or Hollywood. Unusually, they were middle-aged at the time of the publication's debut, making them pretty atypical for the games press even back then. I mean, go back and compare them to something like Zap 64 and its little photos of infant versions of guys barely out of their teens like Jazz Rignall and Richard Ledbetter. I think the maturity and experience of the creative team behind Computer Entertainer allowed them to establish a unique tone for the magazine. It's no-nonsense, informed, opinionated, yet nevertheless fair. Computer Entertainer left its writers' identities and personalities vague, yet the small team behind it nevertheless wrote in the first person and brought their subjective perspectives to bear. This makes it a surprisingly comfortable read for game followers who cut their teeth in the online blog era of media. Even aside from the fact that Computer Entertainer was the only American publication consistently covering games during the post-crash lacuna, making it an essential document of that era, it holds up well today. The VG&CE recently acquired the rights to the entire Computer Entertainer library and made it available for the public to read for free at vghf.org, and I can't recommend checking it out enough. It's one of the most important sources of information and perspective on a lost era of American video games. You'll notice that Computer Entertainer is a low-cost production, essentially a newsletter. It never moved beyond being a couple dozen pages of dense, black-and-white text, low on images, but packed with information. And the reality is that the American console gaming market was so small that there wasn't room for much more than that in 1984 and 85. Heck, if you discount the NES launch lineup, which was available for sale for a few weeks in 1985 in a radius of about 50 miles centered on Manhattan, less than 24 new console games shipped in the US that year. And most of those were held over ColecoVision carts that dropped unceremoniously onto the market as Coleco divested itself of its games business. By the time the 16-bit systems arrived, though, the industry had come roaring back. 1986 saw about 75 games released into the US market, including all of those NES test launch carts. In 1987, that number climbed to more than 100. More than 200 games shipped for US consoles in 1989, and considering that those numbers included several brand new systems whose libraries would hit their full stride a year or two later, it seemed safe to say that games had rebounded and recovered enough to support a slate of related media. Nintendo and Sega's free newsletters paved the way, and Nintendo Power kicked things off. But Nintendo Power was, let's be honest, a marketing tool, more than a source of actual information. If you wanted to get a decent read on the best games for NES, Nintendo Power delivered. If you wanted to know more about competing systems or, say, antitrust lawsuits levied against Nintendo, that information, mysteriously, did not appear in the corporate in-house magazine. However, about half a year after Nintendo Power first arrived, a proper games magazine showed up on US news racks. December 1988 saw the debut of Video Games and Computer Entertainment, an offshoot of Analog magazine headed up by Andy Eddy. A few months later, a flood of similarly minded magazines arrived, By the following summer, game-curious readers could also choose from Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Players, and GamePro. Each magazine had its own distinct personality, focus, and vibe. GamePro, for example, was barely more of an exercise in legitimate journalism than Nintendo Power, focusing almost entirely on previews and reviews and emphasizing slick, colorful layouts and visuals. VG&CE had a more buttoned-down approach, covering computers and consoles in equal measure and presenting pages nearly as dense with text as Computer Entertainer. Game Players felt like a magazine written by moms and uncles for moms and uncles, offering perspectives and coverage that marched to a decidedly different rhythm than the mainstream view. And EGM was an exercise in joyful chaos, aimless in its first few issues, but quickly finding its voice by liberally borrowing coverage concepts, and some claim screenshots and text, from Japanese publication Weekly Famitsu. EGM included everything it could, often haphazardly, but in a way that offered an expansive overview of console gaming trends and releases in both the US and Japan. So anyway, here's the deal. Now that we've hit the 16-bit era and all of my game chronicles have more or less achieved parity, VideoWorks should be a lot less scattered. Going forward, my plan is to cover games by calendar quarters, one platform at a time. Once I finish, for example, the Q489 NES release list, I'll move along to Sega's systems, and so forth. And at the end of each quarter, I'll be producing one of these videos. A media overview of the 3 months concerned. It's one thing for me to blather on about what I think is important about these games, but something else entirely to see what folks who were on the ground covering this era of gaming observed and found worthy of commentary. And then maybe between quarters I'll do a little Metroidvania reminiscing. The future is weird and ill-defined, so who knows? The important thing is that all of this would be impossible without the benevolence of VGHF, the recent Electronic Gaming Monthly documentation Kickstarter campaign, online media repository retromags.com, and the Internet Archive. Give them your support to thank them for their invaluable contributions to video game history. My media focus to date on Nintendo Power and Sega Challenge have really pretty much limited my coverage of media coverage to game-specific content. Those publications didn't really do much in the way of editorializing beyond, "Wow, this game is awesome and you should buy a copy." The reintroduction of generalist magazines into the US meant that, beginning around the middle of 1989, we can finally get a sense of what someone thought about the whole video games thing at the time, beyond the views of Computer Entertainer and the occasional Ed Simrad newspaper column. Not surprisingly, the convalescent state of the US console market resulted in a lot of pieces for these publications that were, well, not exactly navel-gazing, but they certainly had an existential bent to them. Computer Entertainer's June 1989 issue featured a sizable report on that year's Summer Consumer Electronics Show that took joy in the continued growth of the revitalized industry, but also adopted a cautious stance. The newsletter marveled at the fact that Summer CES 1989 featured more games than we can ever remember seeing before. But this celebratory note was followed a few pages later by a rare editorial from the writers called "NES Proliferation Raises Alarm Bells to Those Who Remembered Atari Crash." On a similar note, Arnie Katz penned a piece for VG&CE issue 2 titled, "Will Video Games Crash Again?" Industry veteran Katz seemed a little bit more optimistic than Computer Entertainer's editors, but he correctly noted some points of concern, while also presenting maybe the first accurate summation of the Atari crash. Interest in video games didn't actually die in 1984, but the economic viability of the whole category did. In our free market system, an unprofitable product drops from sight in a hurry. The minute publishers, distributors, and retailers couldn't make money with video games, they switched their efforts to goods that offered a greater return on investment. Ultimately, though, Katz came down on the side of positivity. "A year ago, I thought I knew the answer. I would have said that it is the nature of fads to catch fire, then later turn to ashes, and that video gaming is no different. Today, I'm much less sure. Sales have mounted much faster than they did during the first boom. At the 1983 peak, perhaps 12% of American homes owned game machines. By January 1990, more than one household out of 5 will have a video game system bought within the past 3 years." Similarly, the very first issue of EGM, shaky as it was, opened with an upbeat editorial extolling the bright future that games had ahead of them. Reinforcement for that view came in the third issue of VG&CE, which included a news item on the fact that computer software sales had been bullish over the previous year, primarily on the strength of reinvigorated interest in computer games, which ran in parallel to the rebirth of consoles. A happy follow up to the magazine's first issue report on the fact that the US computer market had pulled itself out of its mid 80s tailspin. Meanwhile, GamePro, unsurprisingly, had nothing of substance to say about the state of gaming. And Game Players set the tone for its off kilter perspective on the medium with the decision that its very first editorial piece in its very first issue should be an in depth look at the Famicom's success in Japan. Which, awesome. No one else was doing that, but maybe as a statement of launch intent, a little out of step with the American mainstream. As a corollary to all of this future of the console industry stuff, the biggest topic to take shape over the course of this period of magazines was, unsurprisingly, the next generation of consoles. Unlike in the present day when everyone except Nintendo reveals their new consoles well in advance of the launch, plans and details for these 16-bit machines and their American incarnations fell into place just a few short months before they arrived in stores. In keeping with its focus on Japan, EGM's very first issue included a hands-on feature about the Japanese Mega Drive, before the console even had an American name or launch date. Game Player's second issue took a similar tack, confident in a US release for the Mega Drive, despite Sega not yet having announced an American name for the machine. The second issue of EGM gave equal time to PC Engine as part of a next-gen cover feature, which broke down the particulars of all the consoles. That feature amusingly included some decidedly meaningless comparisons against the as-yet unknown specs of Nintendo's Super Famicom. Meanwhile, VG&CE focused its energy almost entirely on TurboGrafx 16, with an in-depth preview on the PC Engine CD-ROMs add-on in its very first issue, while dedicating its second issue's cover feature to the TurboGrafx. Over in GamePro, the next-gen race merited a superficial two-page spread, which seems to be about as comprehensive as that magazine could get. Unsurprisingly, the most substantial pre-launch coverage of the new consoles came from Computer Entertainer. As a small publication, Computer Entertainer had only the most passing awareness of import matters, and instead held back from covering the new systems until their official US press events. The May issue featured a Sega Genesis overview and hands-on, while the June issue included a very positive review of the system as well as reports on not one, but two hands-on sessions with the TurboGrafx. Being pretty much a photocopied collection of inkjet pages, Computer Entertainer didn't offer the most incisive showcase of the console's visual capabilities, but the thoughtful writing communicated the strengths and weaknesses of each system effectively. Perhaps less thrilling, but no less important to the future of the industry, was 1989's burgeoning handheld race. As I've mentioned before, Nintendo Power barely acknowledged the Game Boy's existence prior to launch. Computer Entertainer did a much better job of informing game enthusiasts about the handheld, making its lead article for May 1989 a Game Boy preview, seemingly based on import experience. Besides explaining the console's nature, Computer Entertainer smartly called out Tetris as the best possible candidate to be the console's pack-in cartridge. The following issue introduced the Atari Lynx into the picture, painting it as a brewing battle between handheld rivals. VG&CE offered a similar perspective in their second issue, though the magazine also took the time to make note of a third contender in the handheld space, Tiger Electronics, who had revealed plans to launch their own line of modern, updated Game & Watch-style LCD systems. EGM presented a fairly comprehensive look at Game Boy in its second issue. As for GamePro, they managed to muster about as much space to look at the entire Game Boy Lynx conflict as VG&CE dedicated to Tiger handhelds. Those may have been the big topics for the summer period, but that certainly wasn't the only gaming news in the wind at the time. Here are a few things that magazines reported on at the time which stand out to me in hindsight. All of the publications that cared to present actual news coverage, that is, Computer Entertainer, EGM, and VG&CE, put news of the Nintendo and Tengen lawsuit over Tetris and unlicensed NES console publishing freedoms front and center. That's understandable. Nintendo was the anchor that the video game revival had been affixed to, and here was someone attempting to take that Goliath down a peg. There was also a pretty clear understanding within the press at the time that Tetris publishing rights for consoles would potentially turn out to be a pretty big deal, though I don't think anyone grasped just how big Tetris would end up being. VG&CE also included a news bite on the fact that a judge had reversed the initial ruling on Data East's Look and Feel lawsuit regarding Karate Champ, which means that, from what I understand, they had opened the door once again to an age of video game clones, just in time for a flood of brawlers and Street Fighter wannabes. Computer Entertainer and VG&CE provided breakdowns of all the companies publishing for NES as of Summer CES 1989. According to the former, the number had climbed to more than 50. Meanwhile, the one little bit of news that managed to sneak into GamePro was the announcement that Golgo 13 comics would be published in America, a factoid that also appeared in Computer Entertainer and Nintendo Power. Honestly, the real treasure trove of news comes from EGM, which included a monthly gossip sheet by the pseudonymous Quarterman. Although this presented its items in a shotgun blast of text and used the rumor label as cover to occasionally get things wrong, there's a lot of stuff in here that would probably be forgotten if not for its inclusion in Quarterman's column. Of note, in the first issue, we have Hasbro formally canceling plans for its VHS-based games console Nemo, the platform that spawned Night Trap. There's a belated note on the Sega Mega Drive's debut in Japan, and wildly optimistic rumors that Nintendo would launch its competing 16-bit Super Famicom in Japan in September of 1989. Konix also tossed its hat into the next generation ring with the announcement that they'd be producing a 16-bit device called Slipstream. The plan was for Slipstream to be distributed by Epix, the same Epix that was in the process of being absorbed into Atari and stripped for parts. Bad luck for Konix. Also, an interesting refutation. Mattel, it turned out, would not be localizing the PC engine for the US market. Considering that the company had abandoned games and left Intellivision to wither after the crash, I had no idea that this was even a possibility. Quarterman's second column reported on the official names for Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 in the US, while also making note of the fact that major third parties had signed on to produce Game Boy software. How could they not, noted Quarterman, when Nintendo expected to sell as many as 5 million of the systems? There's also an unusually lengthy aside here where Quarterman goes after Nintendo spokesman Howard Phillips for belittling Konami's Biomiracle Bokute Upa as being insufficiently mature and awesome for US release. Apparently, Quarterman was a savvy import gamer who knew what was up. Of course, the real meat and potatoes of the game press has always been the games, stupid. And there's plenty of those in this magazine, though I have to say the summer 1989 slate of games coverage across these mags was pretty weird in the aggregate. I think because so many of these publications had just gotten off the ground, a lot of the contributors were dealing with a pent-up desire to write about games they'd been enjoying during the US game press's interregnum. For VG&CE and game players in particular, these early issues read less like an attempt to give players a feel for the current pulse of the industry, and more like a chance for a bunch of writers to gush about their favorite releases since the NES launch nearly 4 years earlier. That's why you end up, for example, with Game Player's debut issue in mid-1989 crowning Super Mario Bros. As its Game of the Month. Not Super Mario Bros. 2 from half a year earlier, and not the upcoming Super Mario Bros. 3, which is previewed in the same issue. No, the first Super Mario Bros. From 1985. Not exactly timely there, but that's no worse than VG&E dedicating multiple pages of its own debut issue to an extensive Alex Kidd and Miracle World strategy guide. Even bearing in mind the longer lives that games lived in the 1980s, that still seems like massively straining the bounds of what 99.9% of readers wanted to spend their money on in mid-1989. Honestly, the best and most current coverage of the era's game releases can be found in Computer Entertainer. You don't get useful screenshots, and sometimes you stumble across some odd opinions, like Bionic Commando for NES getting its score dinged, despite the writer's effusive praise for the game because it had a badly written manual. But Computer Entertainer based all of its games coverage on actual hands-on experience. So you only see reviews of recent releases that had actually hit retail, and their previews are always based on demos at press and industry events like CES. And the magazine's universal affection for games as a medium led to some substantial Sega coverage, such as the entire July video game update section opening with a massive chunk of Sega 8-bit reviews in anticipation of the Genesis. Possibly the only contemporary American media coverage of Time Soldiers, Alex Kidd and High Tech World, Montezuma's Revenge, and King's Quest. They also liked Altered Beast for Master System, like a lot. Computer Entertainer was great, but they didn't always get it right. Other notable games that Computer Entertainer picked up for review in this period include classics like Legacy of the Wizard, Ninja Gaiden, and Mega Man 2, along with not classics like Taboo, Alf, and Airwolf. Of course, Nintendo Power and Sega Challenge sat at the other end of the spectrum from Computer Entertainer, and basically only covered games, with each feature containing more or less equal parts hype, gameplay overviews, and early content strategy guides to help ease players into the action. I've already showcased most of the titles featured in these issues, everything in the April '89 Sega Challenge, in fact, though Nintendo Power did have a few advanced features on games I haven't quite reached yet. Clash at Demon Head showed up as early as the May-June '89 issue, and DuckTales, Iron Sword, Roger Rabbit, and RoboCop appear in the July-August edition. Weirdly, the one thing you found in almost every publication besides Nintendo Power was advance intel on what would be the single biggest standalone release for NES of all time, the aforementioned Super Mario Bros. 3. VG&CE, EGM, and Game Players all gave it a look in their respective sophomore issues, while GamePro highlighted it in their very first issue. As an aside, I'm fairly certain that the first issue of GamePro was given away for free, possibly to customers who bought video games at Toys R Us during a certain period. I know I somehow owned the first issue of the magazine, and no other issues, after being given a complimentary copy somewhere. And in my copy, I skipped right past the surprising in hindsight profile on Desert Falcon for Atari 7800 so that I could obsess over the Mario 3 spread on the next page. It's kind of a shame I didn't pick up the second issue of GamePro, because I didn't just miss out on in-depth pieces on Dark Chambers and Airball, a rare look at an XE game system release, but the magazine dedicated a whopping 4 pages to the Famicom release of Gradius 2 that never made it here. It's so bizarre to see such a slight, anodyne publication go all in for a hardcore import release. I bet someone was fired for that mistake. Actually, there's a fair amount of Atari console coverage in these issues, something that would dry up and disappear almost immediately after. VG&CE covered Dark Chambers in its premiere issue, reviewed Ms. Pac-Man for XE in its second issue, and eventually went to bat for Tengen Tetris. I mean, yes, that's an NES game, but it was Atari, you know. Game Players might actually have the most interesting mix of games coverage. Besides their glowing praise, correctly, for Golgo 13, Bionic Commando, and inexplicably Amagon, they also presented a huge Master System preview for the year ahead, delved into the new and untested world of shareware, and even showcased Cyan's debut release for Macintosh, The Manhole. Anyway, yeah, video games. That's what the American Games Press had to say about them in May through July 1989. Again, I'll check in on the media quarterly going forward. I imagine future updates will be a lot less weird as publications get their bearings, figure out their editorial focus, and get a grip in general. And likewise for myself as I figure out exactly the best way to cover this stuff. But the figuring it out as we go along nature of this material is all part of a great video games tradition too. No one really knows what they're doing here. That's it for this quarter. See you next mission.